Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a weekly political news show. I'm your host, Robert. I wanted to let you all know that I'm not nearly as ill as I was a week ago. I'm still a little bit stuffy, so that's on the upside. I should be sounding a little bit more normal. I also want to play a quick clip of how I feel, and I'm sure how many of us feel, from my favorite childhood show, SpongeBob. Take it away, Squidward.
All I really want is to live in a world where I can just relax in peace and quiet. Is that too much to ask?
Yes, Squidward, me too. Me too. I feel the same way. We all just want some peace and quiet, but here we are. Anyway, on to the news. So I would argue this is one of the more tamer weeks of the Trump administration so far, but we're still pretty busy. So what's happened? Well, there's a lot of impacts more on foreign policy. That's the news at the beginning of the week, and I want to kind of recap it. Usually I don't prefer to talk about foreign policy, but I'm still going to go over it because I think it's important. As I mentioned last episode, J.D. Vance was in Munich at the security conference, and Trump has been spatting with Zelensky over peace talks. He was meeting with governors this week. It was on Thursday or Friday, I think, and he said, I had a good talk with Putin, but with Zelensky, not so much. He's playing his cards, which he doesn't have any. He's playing them well. I'm like, okay, all right. As the days go by, I've been getting more and more confused about what the strategy is here. First, it appeared that he wanted to negotiate peace with Russia and Ukraine himself as the mediator, but then he started telling everybody that Ukraine is a dictatorship because they don't have any elections, and the irony is part of this is true considering Ukraine canceled their election last year due to the war, and they're under martial law. I digress, but that's because they're under war. I still wouldn't call Ukraine a dictatorship. I would say they're at war, which is what this whole thing is about. So attacking Ukraine but not Putin suggests that he's not really interested in negotiating with himself as a mediator. He also said the U.S. should not be the one to make sure that this peace deal lasts, which I totally agree with, and it should be up to Europe considering Ukraine is in Europe. But the problem is we can't negotiate a peace deal, exclude the people that it actually matters for, and then dump it on somebody else to enforce. That's illogical. Then there's the possible alcoholic Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, who's been conceding Ukrainian negotiation ground and literal actual ground, saying that Ukraine cannot return to pre-2014 borders, which is true. I mean, that makes sense. Ukraine is not going to go back to the way it was in like 2013. But we still shouldn't be saying that. We shouldn't be conceding ground. That's not what you do before negotiations, where you give up a bunch of ground and then go into negotiations. Usually you're hard on it. You're firm, and then you go from there. This makes me think a few things. One, Trump has actually no plan to negotiate peace in Ukraine, and now looking back, it was a lot more obvious than I thought. Two, he either cares more about Russia or doesn't care about this whole situation at all. And number three, he's prepared to unilaterally withdraw support for Ukraine, which would basically end Ukraine because Europe alone does not have the defense capacity to give Ukraine, and probably not enforce the peace deal either. So they're while also defending their own country. As I talked about in the last episode, Europe's economies are not doing very well right now. Germany, France, Italy, the UK, and Spain are all in a period of stagnation, as well as a lot of the other European countries. And I just mentioned those because those are the largest. Speaking of Germany, as I'm writing this episode, there's still no information about the election results, so I'll need to talk about that in the next episode. If you don't know, Germany held an election yesterday. As you're listening to this on Monday, we're not going to know who's going to be in charge in Germany for a couple of weeks, maybe even a few months, but because of how their electoral system works. But that might also have implications for the future of Ukrainian defense and security. So what does this all mean? Well, I really don't know, and it is very confusing, and I doubt that Trump has much of a strategy here. Sounds like I had a better strategy than he did, if he even has one, which I doubt. GOP lawmakers, they're definitely not happy about this. The congressman with the best name, Representative Don Bacon, who also represents a district Kamala Harris won, stated, Putin started this war. Putin committed war crimes. Putin is the dictator who murdered his opponents. The EU nations have contributed more to Ukraine, and Zelensky polls over 50%. Now, that sounds random, like, all right, he just threw a bunch of things together. All these things are true, and these are all the opposite of what Trump has said. Sadly, I think this guy has a decent shot at losing his seat in the next election, although I haven't looked into the specifics, and other lawmakers are not happy about it either. The Senate Majority Leader, John Thune, who took over from Chuck Schumer, basically implied that Trump was wrong about who started the war, and Trump is wrong. Trump blamed Zelensky for starting the war when it was actually Putin, and I know NATO did kind of push Putin's buttons, but still. Yet they still think that all the Republican congressmen think that he can still end the war, even though Trump is wrong about the basic facts of the war, or at least he's wrong publicly about it. And well, I usually try to see what everyone's doing and evaluate their plans and make a fair judgment. I really don't know what this plan is, as I said. Maybe it will emerge, but I don't see how. There is other news, however, and it shows that the first Trump case has reached the Supreme Court. While it's a pretty boring case in my opinion, it will show just how much the court is willing to side with Trump. This is specifically about an attempt to fire a top government watchdog. Trump fired Hampton Dillinger, the head of the Office of Special Counsel, which is supposed to protect federal employees and applicants from whistleblower retaliations. Mr. Dillinger is in post for now, because that's what a court ruled, which prompted Trump to seek an emergency motion to the high court to get him kicked out of his position. Remember from last summer, Trump has immunity in handling federal agencies. But once again, I have to play lawyer here, and it's the last thing I want to do. At the same time, though, it seems strange that the court is forcing Dillinger to stay. Usually a president can fire heads of departments without an issue. If this order from the lower court remains, this could set a precedent that not just Trump, but any U.S. president cannot remove incompetent people. Now you can say, is this guy actually incompetent? I don't know. But usually it's up to the president to do that. This has its ups and downs, but I'm not going to get into it. We'll see what happens, but I think the Supreme Court is going to strike this down. I would be shocked if they let the lower court ruling stay in place and thus Dillinger in his post. My prediction simply is that they're going to side with Trump on this one. Next, speaking of layoffs, a federal judge has ruled that Trump can continue to lay off the federal workforce. A bid was brought in by labor unions to block the attempt to downsize the 2.3 million strong federal workforce. The IRS seems to be the next place for targets, and then the Defense Department as well. This is right in the middle of tax season. I imagine fewer agents will be able to collect less revenue, and it will take longer for Americans to get their tax returns, which nobody wants. The judge didn't approve of these layoffs, but he can't stop them either. He wrote that, quote, Trump's onslaught of executive orders have caused, some say by design, disruption and even chaos in widespread quarters of American society, unquote. He also said that he does not have the power to hear the case. Instead, unions must file complaints with the Federal Labor Board. So this is a temporary win for Trump. If you aren't aware, workers in the public sector have much more protections than they do in the private sector. In the private sector, there's something called at-will employment, unless you sign some sort of a contract. But in the government, many more laws apply. Basically, I'll put it this way: if you're in the private sector, all they have to do is not break laws that are on the books. They can't discriminate based on age, sex, race, disability, etc. But otherwise, they can do pretty much whatever they want. In the government, it's the opposite. State and local government as well. Instead of being super open, it's very restricted, and there's just a few things they're allowed to remove people based on. Government definitely has similarities to the private sector, but there are many differences, and this is one of them. It's a flaw in the system, I agree, and that's what's going to make firing all these people so difficult. As for DOGE, last I heard, they claim to have found $55 billion in savings, although only $16 billion was accounted for, and that's mostly in canceled contracts. Then they cut it down to $7.2 billion. There was a $9 billion error. So out of all the chaos that has happened that you've heard on the news, only $7 billion has been saved, which is a lot of money. I mean, I'll admit, $7 billion is a lot of money to any individual, but in comparison to the $4 trillion budget, that's less than 1%. It's very little. If you ask me, this so far has not been worth it. I would have liked to see an audit that takes a year, maybe two, and then they implement the cuts. After they are finished looking at everything and they decide, okay, what's the most important and what's the least important, not just chopping and changing as they go. Next, it's been a few weeks since we talked about Trump's approval, and the story has changed just a little bit from then. When he entered office, there was a positive approval rating of about +5 to +7. Different polls said different things. Some polls had it even, some polls had it up +10. Now it's about 1 to 2% on the Real Clear Politics polling average, which I've been using for the last 8 years. His approval is likely to drop. Some polls are already showing his approval underwater. This is really not a great place to be because, as I've said, his approval is only going to drop, and as the months and years go by, this is going to weaken his political power. If you're a Democrat, this is great news for you, although I'd say Trump still has a decent amount of political power. It's going to change in the coming months, but we see it every time. But it's coming, believe me. Second to last, well, no, we have a lot to go. This is third to last. Congress has finally taken some action. The Senate passed a $340 billion spending package, which prioritizes some of President Trump's priorities. It passed 52 to 48 with Rand Paul, who's a Republican, voting with the Democrats. This is more money for defense and immigration while also encouraging more fossil fuel drilling. This still needs to be passed by the House, where there's a very narrow majority, just 218 to 215 now, and they can only afford to lose one vote. Meanwhile, Trump has endorsed the House version, which doesn't even exist yet, and it combines all of his legislative goals into one package. Since it has taken House Republicans so long to put it together, I recommend that they go one by one. Each thing they want to do, they just pass a bill. Senator Paul, who voted against it, is concerned about spending and thinks that savings from Elon Musk, which remember is only $7 billion, should be put toward the border. Democrats, on the other hand, were not able to do too much during this process because they were in the minority, or they are in the minority. They threw everything they had, and they still couldn't do anything. And that's just how government works. Elections have consequences. It's what happens when you put one of the most unpopular candidates in history against Donald Trump. One amendment, I'm just saying that, not to relitigate that all over again. But one amendment was to prevent tax cuts for the wealthy if Medicaid funding was cut, even just $1. That was proposed by Chuck Schumer, and that amendment was defeated, 51 to 49, with only Josh Hawley and Susan Collins voting with the Democrats. I think the irony here is that the Pentagon budget is going to be expanded by $150 billion, even when it is already over $8 billion. And even as Elon Musk and Trump want to shrink the Pentagon budget and not expand it. J.D. Vance, who's in Congress, well, he was in Congress, believes the package will be done by May or June, which he admits is optimistic. At this point, I am highly doubtful this package is going to be passed until July or maybe in September, because they go on holiday over the summer. Compare this to Democrats, who have just thin majorities. They passed the American Rescue Plan, and it was signed by President Biden in early March 2021. They got $2 trillion in spending passed in less than 2 months, but Republicans can barely spend a few $100 billion, and that takes months. And in both situations, it's expected to pass with only one party support. The American Rescue Plan passed with just Democrat support. These packages are going to pass with only Republican support. So think about that. The American Rescue Plan. I did not like the American Rescue Plan. I'm not praising it. But what I'm saying is that Democrats are more united. The evidence is there. Shows just how bad Republicans are at governing, even when they have full control of the government. Will the $340 billion pass? I'm going to guess probably not, but I acknowledge that it might. It depends on if Johnson wants to pick it up. Then there's the whole government shutdown, which is slated to begin on March 14th. Republicans need to decide a course of action here. I doubt Democrats are going to help him like they did last time back in December because of the threats of cuts. There really is no incentive for Democrats to support this. Needless to say, I expect a lot of gridlock for the next year and a half ahead before the midterms. I don't see a lot of legislative accomplishments like under Biden, but I expect a lot more executive orders instead, and we've seen it already. 2 more things. As you probably heard, and I'm very late in covering it, only because there's been so much other news, RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, and Kash Patel have been confirmed to Trump's cabinet. Kash Patel as FBI director, Tulsi Gabbard as the DNI, and RFK Jr. to the health position. I like Gabbard because she's anti-war and anti-establishment. Don't know too much about Patel, but I was against RFK Jr. I made that clear in at least one episode in the past. I think he's abhorrent in what he said about disabled people, well, implied about disabled people through vaccines. And I'm shocked that there hasn't been more outrage. But to anyone who's upset about any of these three, as I'm upset about one of them, let me remind you how many of Trump's appointees lasted the full 4 years in the last administration. It was almost none of them. I could probably count them on one hand. So I doubt all three are going to last. And if I put my money on it, none of them are going to be sitting watching the next president's inauguration on January 20th, 2029. Lastly, I want to throw in there that Trump will be addressing Congress in just about 2 weeks. I haven't seen a lot of news about this, but this seems like a big deal if you ask me. I don't have an exact date on me. I think it's March the 4th, but don't hold me to it. And this is not a State of the Union that usually happens when there isn't an inauguration on the same year, so there will be one next year and the year after and the year after that, but not this year. This is officially called a joint session of Congress. So this is basically the same thing. Biden had one in 2021, Trump had one in 2017, and Obama had one in 2013, going all the way back. So we're not going to hear the famous, the state of our union is, whatever the word that they want to use. Instead, we're going to wait to see that in 2026. A joint session of Congress is basically just something, just to kind of lay out the agenda for the next year, although that's basically what a State of the Union is. But we're not going to hear, oh, the state of our union, as I've said. The state of our union is great. Or in the case of Ford, that was famous, the state of our union is not good. We're definitely not going to hear not good from Trump. Anyway, that is it for this episode. I know it's a little bit shorter, but our episodes are only supposed to be 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes long, but they keep running over. So now I'm sure it's nice to have a slightly shorter one. Who knows what's coming next? I don't think we're going to be getting any peace and quiet anytime soon. I haven't watched SpongeBob in recent years, but I'm pretty sure Squidward feels the same way that I do, and it's a shame. He's so relatable. And when we were all kids, we didn't think that. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.